This video is brought to you by Squarespace. In December 1965, the Beatles released an album that changed everything. And depending on where you lived, it sounded and even felt completely different. 2 albums, 1 name. And for 60 years, fans have debated which version is the real Rubber Soul. I'm Andrew from Parlogram, and in this video, we're diving deep into both versions of this amazing album, why they're different, what those differences are, and how they completely changed the experience of listening to this pivotal record in the Beatles' career. Before we get into the tracks, let's step back into late 1965, because Rubber Soul didn't appear in a vacuum. The Beatles were exhausted from touring, filming, and trying to keep up with the world's expectations of them. John was becoming more introspective, Paul more sophisticated, George more confident, and Ringo, as always, was holding the whole thing together. Outside the studio, something new was taking hold: folk rock. Dylan, the Byrds, and the idea that pop music could carry meaning. This was the moment the Beatles began to think in terms of albums, not just singles, and into that world they delivered Rubber Soul. The sessions ran for just over a month, from October the 12th to November the 15th. A tight schedule, but the band were changing the way they worked. They were now allowed to spend longer in the studio, and for the first time, sessions regularly went past midnight. Their songwriting matured almost overnight. Stories, characters, adult emotions. The Beatles were growing up, and the songs reflected it. But there's something crucial to understand. There isn't just one Rubber Soul. There are 2. Ever since the Beatles' debut album, Capitol had been assembling their own Beatles albums. Unlike in the UK, where 14 tracks was the norm for an LP, Capitol's policy was to include just 12 on theirs. In the UK, royalties were calculated on the album as a whole, but in the US, payment was calculated per track. So having 14 tracks on an album would have reduced Capitol's profit on each album. It became accepted practice, and as most US fans at the time had little idea of what was being released in Britain, Capitol got away with it. This also meant that as time went by, Capitol were able to reserve certain tracks for albums of their own making, and under the terms of their contract, there was nothing the Beatles could do about it. So the first major difference is that the UK album has 14 tracks and the US has 12. The UK version, the original approved by the band and cut by Harry Moss at Abbey Road on November the 16th, 1965, just one day after the sessions ended, opens with Drive My Car.
1, 2, 3, 4.
But things turned out very differently in America. Dave Dexter Jr, head of A&R at Capitol since the early 1950s, had been responsible for some of the label's biggest stars, including Sinatra and Nat King Cole. A jazz man at heart, he loathed pop music, especially from Britain, and had rejected all of the Beatles' early singles, until EMI forced the head of Capitol to issue I Want to Hold Your Hand. However, he knew the American market, and no one can deny that the Beatles' albums he put together sold incredibly well and served their purpose perfectly. In the beginning, the Beatles didn't mind. They would have done anything to break in America, and if that meant butchering their albums for the US market, it was a price worth paying. And they were making a lot of money. However, with success came power, and by the time John Lennon was confronted with Capitol's Help soundtrack in August 1965, he couldn't hide his confusion and anger about how their albums were being presented in America. Still, they were far too busy to worry about Rubber Soul, and Dexter, although not a fan of the music, knew exactly who he was marketing it to, and decided to make some changes. Unlike some of the tracks on previous Capitol albums, Dexter didn't meddle too much with the sound of Rubber Soul. A little compression and some mild reverb were about as far as it went. There's certainly no I Feel Fine moment on this album. Because Help was issued as a soundtrack album in the US, only the film songs plus Ken Thorne's incidental music, Dexter found himself with a number of leftover tracks from the UK Help album to work with. Needing only 12 songs for an album, Dexter added 2 of the leftover Help tracks to Rubber Soul and held back 4 songs from the UK running order for future use. One of his most consequential decisions was to remove the UK album's upbeat opener, Drive My Car, and replace it with Paul's brisk acoustic number, I've Just Seen a Face. Changing the opening track wasn't just a sequencing tweak, it reshaped the entire way American listeners understood the album. The first track on any LP sets the emotional temperature, and in 1965, when albums were typically heard from start to finish, it carried enormous weight. After that, both the UK and US albums follow the same path, with Norwegian Wood and You Won't See Me.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
John's amazing Norwegian Wood features the first use of sitar in a Western pop record and stands as one of the album's finest moments.
1, 2, 3, 4.
You Won't See Me follows with Paul's song of emotional distance, recorded quickly with a tempo that rises slightly as it goes, giving the track a relentless urgency that suits the lyric. Both songs sit in the same positions on the UK and US editions, providing a brief stretch of shared continuity before the albums diverge again. The next track is Nowhere Man, one of the album's most important moments, and another major omission from the US edition. Here, John moves into pure philosophy, writing not about love, but about identity, isolation, and uncertainty. It's sharp, striking, and completely unlike anything the Beatles had recorded before. On the UK album, it adds real depth and emotional weight to side 1, but Dexter removed it entirely for the American release, holding it back for Yesterday and Today. Losing Nowhere Man significantly alters the feel of the US Rubber Soul. The introspective edge disappears, and with it, a key part of the album's evolving maturity.
1, 2, 3, 4.
George's Think For Yourself holds its position on both albums, but The Word is the first track where the differences between the UK and US mixes becomes noticeable. In both versions, John's lead vocal sits in the right channel, but the UK mix spreads the backing vocals more evenly across the stereo image. On the verses, the Capitol mix uses a double-track John, whereas the UK version presents him single-tracked, like this.
Now that I know what I feel must be right, I'm here to show everybody the light. Now that I know what I feel must be right, I'm here to show everybody the light.
And at the very end of the song, the UK version fades naturally, while the US mix cuts off before the fade completes. Before we skip to the next track, I'd like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Squarespace, who've supported the channel for a long time now, and I'm delighted they're continuing that support into 2026.
How do you work these things, George? You just lean forward. Quick! How do I stop? That's one way. Look, it's a sign. What's it say? Stay tuned for this important message.
If you've ever thought about building something online, a portfolio, a blog, a shop, or even a place to document your record collection, Squarespace has everything you need. Their stylish award-winning templates look clean and modern immediately, and they're fully customizable without touching a line of code. You can upload photos, audio clips, videos, organize galleries, set up mailing lists, and even run an online store. And everything works beautifully on mobile. To try it yourself, head on over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Parlogram to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.
Michelle, take one.
Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Michelle finishes side 1 on both albums, a melody Paul began in art school, chanson influenced and beautifully crafted. At the time, it was widely hailed as the new Yesterday, leading to 2 different versions by David and Jonathan and the Overlanders battling it out in the UK charts, which the Overlanders won.
1, 2, 1.
Side 2 of the UK album opens with What Goes On. Written by John in the late 1950s and demoed in early 1963 as a possible follow-up to Please Please Me, it was finally revived during the rush to complete Rubber Soul. Paul and Ringo helped rework the lyrics, giving Ringo his first official songwriting credit. However, Dexter wasn't impressed and removed it entirely from the US album, holding it back for Yesterday and Today. In contrast, Side 2 of the US album opens with It's Only Love, originally on Help in the UK. John famously disliked the lyrics, calling them abysmal, but his vocal is one of his finest mid-period performances. Musically, it fits the US album's tone remarkably well and helps define that distinctive wood-grain character many American fans still associate with Rubber Soul. The next 4 tracks appear in the same order on both albums, but there's one notable difference. Girl remains unchanged, but it's I'm Looking Through You that sets the 2 editions apart. While the UK mix plays the song straight, the US stereo version includes something unheard of on British Beatles releases at the time: 2 brief false starts, left in by Capitol. It's a small detail, but one that makes the American LP instantly recognisable to anyone who grew up with it.
2, 3, 4.
In My Life remains a centrepiece on both albums. John's first true autobiographical song, shaped melodically by Paul and elevated by George Martin's beautifully sped up Baroque piano solo. Wait, revived from the Help sessions and finished with fresh overdubs, is one of the few moments where 2 Beatles eras overlap within a single track, and it appears in the same place on both records. But the run of shared material ends there.
1, 2, 3, 4.
On the UK album, the next track is George's If I Needed Someone, his strongest early composition. Chiming 12-string Rickenbacker, Birds-inspired harmonies, and a confidence that points directly towards the band's future. Dexter removed it entirely from the US version, another significant omission, holding it back for Yesterday and Today. Its absence noticeably alters the shape and balance of the American Rubber Soul.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Run for Your Life closes both albums, a musically energetic but lyrically unsettling track that John later said he hated. Interestingly, contemporary reviewers often praised it, showing just how differently the album was heard in 1965. Across most of the world, it was the UK edition of Rubber Soul that became the standard. Only the US and Canada issued Dave Dexter Jr.'s reconfigured version. Venezuela initially followed the UK tracklist as well, but in the late 1970s they quietly switched to the American configuration, a rare instance of a country adopting the US lineup after the fact. One thing both versions of Rubber Soul share is Robert Freeman's famous stretched photograph, the accident-turned-design feature that instantly made the album look as modern as it sounded. But while the image is the same, the covers themselves weren't identical across countries. The UK sleeve has a noticeably richer, warmer tone. This is partly down to the UK printer's colour balancing and the type of laminate used on the front panel, which tends to make the colours appear denser and more saturated. The US Capitol edition, by contrast, with an unlaminated front panel, often appears brighter and lighter. The brown background shifts towards olive green, and the band's faces can look a touch washed out compared to the UK original. To me, they both give off a very different vibe. Which one do you prefer? In short, same photograph, 2 very different looks. And for many fans, the colour of their Rubber Soul is as much a part of the album's identity as the music inside. So, what's the best way of hearing this album? That is, of course, subjective, But if you want to take the purists route, the UK mono album is the one to go for. First pressings with the -1 matrices are rather harsh sounding, so much so that collectors have dubbed them the loud cut. Subsequent mono cuttings, -4 and -5, were done by EMI's only female cutting engineer Hazel Yarwood, who applied her expertise from cutting classical albums to Rubber Soul, resulting in the best-sounding mono pressings. The stereo mix is much more of a curate's egg. The original 1965 stereo mix was superseded in 1987 by George Martin's remix, which is the version that appears on the original CDs. The original stereo mix was included on the CD of the mono album in the 2009 mono box, and is the stereophile purist's choice. I'm sorry to say that for me, the US vinyl versions sound flat and lifeless, and for sound quality are best avoided. If you do want to hear this album, I recommend the 2006 CD version on this box set, which is in both mono and stereo. Which brings me to one of the hot topics of the moment, the Rubber Soul remixes. We've already had some remix teaser tracks from this album on the 2023 edition of 62 to 66, and very good they were too. And I hope it's not too long before we can hear the rest of them. Rubber Soul arrived in the UK on the 3rd of December 1965, and the demand was immediate. It entered the UK album chart at #1 the following week, replacing The Sound of Music, and stayed at the top for 8 consecutive weeks, remaining on the chart for a total of 42 weeks, an extraordinary run for the time. In the US, the Capitol version was released 3 days later on December the 6th, 1965, and sales were even more explosive. It reportedly sold over 1.2 million copies in its first 9 days, hitting #1 on the Billboard Top LP chart on the 8th of January 1966. The American album remained on the charts for 59 weeks, confirming its status not only as a commercial triumph, but as one of the most successful Beatles albums of the decade. Thanks to the abundance of music papers in the UK in the 1960s, we can still see how Rubber Soul was received at the time, and the reaction was far from unanimous. One Record Mirror reviewer was cautiously impressed, calling the album a new direction for the group, and singling out Norwegian Wood as one of the most effective things the boys have recorded. You can sense them recognising a shift, even if they haven't quite grasped its significance. In the same issue, Richard Green heard something very different. He dismissed the LP outright, calling it disappointing and claiming that over half the tracks would not be worthy of release. He said that the album had none of the old Beatles excitement, and even argued that Rubber Soul cannot support Lennon and McCartney's reputation as the songwriting team of the day. He described Girl as very sad and weepy, praised John's vocal, but clearly felt the song dragged. He suggested Michelle would be over the heads of their fans, and rated cornerstone tracks like Drive My Car, Norwegian Wood and Wait only just okay. And perhaps the most surprising line of all, he concluded the best track must be Run For Your Life. These reviews make one thing clear. Rubber Soul didn't fit into the template of what a Beatles album was supposed to be. It was quieter, more thoughtful, more adult, and critics were reacting in real time, often after only 1 or 2 listens. 60 years on, their split reactions show that the Beatles were evolving faster than the press, faster than the industry, and in many ways, faster than their own audience. Rubber Soul wasn't just ahead of its time, it took the world a while to catch up. So, which one wins? Well, none of them. And maybe that's the point. Rubber Soul isn't a competition. It's a crossroads. 2 different albums that grew out of the same sessions, the same burst of creativity. The UK version shows where the Beatles were heading. The US version shows how the world heard them. And they are both part of the album's story. 60 years on, the real winner is the music itself. Still fresh, still surprising, and still changing the way we hear the Beatles. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which version did you grow up with? Which pressing do you prefer? And what song defines the album for you? Let me know in the comments. I'll be back next weekend with more Beatles history. But that's all for this one, so I'll say bye for now and thanks for watching.